You already know Surrealism. You know it from melting clocks, lobster telephones, paintings that look like dreams gone wrong. You know it so well that you probably think it was an art movement, a style, a set of visual tricks. It was none of these. Surrealism was a theory of the mind, a political program, and a metaphysical wager, all bound together by a single claim. The claim was that ordinary rational consciousness is not the deepest or truest form of experience, that beneath the surface of daily thought there runs a current of images, desires, and connections that reason cannot reach and will not acknowledge. And that accessing this current is not a luxury or a game. It is the most urgent task a human being can undertake. This claim had consequences. It meant the Surrealists had to develop techniques for bypassing rational control. It meant they had to confront Freud, who had mapped the unconscious but wanted to discipline it. It meant they had to take a position on revolution, because if society is built on the suppression of deeper experience, then liberating the mind is a political act. And it meant they had to face the hardest question any movement can face, whether the thing they were looking for actually exists. The story of Surrealism runs from the trenches of the First World War to debates in neuroscience laboratories today. It crosses painting, poetry, film, photography, philosophy, and politics. It produced masterpieces and manifestos, excommunications and betrayals, genuine discoveries about the mind, and catastrophic blind spots about power. To understand it, you need all of it. Part 1. The Failure of Reason. The men who would create Surrealism came of age inside a catastrophe. Between 1914 and 1918, the most technologically advanced, most scientifically educated, most philosophically sophisticated civilization in human history fed roughly 10 million soldiers into mechanized slaughter. This was not a failure of barbarism. It was a failure of reason. André Breton, the future founder of the movement, served as a medical orderly in psychiatric wards during the war. He treated soldiers whose minds had broken under bombardment. Men who could not stop shaking, could not speak, could not recognize where they were. The official diagnosis was shell shock. The unofficial reality was that the rational mind, pushed past its limits, simply disintegrated. This mattered for what came next. Breton did not leave the war thinking that reason needed to be improved or reformed. He left thinking that the entire hierarchy of mental life that European civilization had built since the Enlightenment was wrong. The hierarchy said that reason sits at the top, governing the passions and the instincts below it. The war suggested that this governing faculty could produce mass death as efficiently as it could produce philosophy. The question this raised was not new. Nietzsche had already argued that rational morality was a mask for deeper drives. Bergson had already proposed that the intellect carves up a flowing reality into dead categories. But the war made these arguments feel different. Before 1914, they were provocations within philosophy. After 1918, they were descriptions of what had just happened. There is a specific kind of disillusionment that matters here. It is not cynicism. Cynicism says nothing matters. The post-war generation said the opposite. Everything matters, but the tools we have been using to make sense of everything are broken. Logic, progress, rational governance, the idea that education and science would make humanity better. All of this had been tested, and it had produced Verdun. This is the soil surrealism grew from. Not boredom, not aestheticism, not a desire to shock the bourgeoisie. A genuine conviction that the Enlightenment model of the mind had failed, and that whatever came next would have to begin by going beneath the rational surface to find out what was actually there. Part 2. Dada and the Limits of Destruction. Before Surrealism, there was Dada, and Dada's answer to the catastrophe was total negation. Founded in Zurich in 1916 by a loose group of artists and poets, including Hugo Ball, Tristan Tzara, Hans Arp, and Richard Hülsenbeck, Dada declared war on everything. On art, on meaning, on logic, on language itself. If rational civilization produced the trenches, then rationality was the enemy. And if the institutions of culture, the museums, the academies, the literary journals had endorsed that civilization, then those institutions were complicit. The tactics were deliberately absurd. Tzara wrote poems by pulling words from a hat. Ball recited sound poems in a cardboard costume, syllables stripped of all meaning. Marcel Duchamp submitted a urinal to an art exhibition and titled it Fountain. The logic was precise even when the surface was chaotic. If a urinal can be art, then the category of art has no stable boundary. If a poem can be random words, then the authority of the author is a fiction. Every gesture aimed at the same target, the pretense that human culture rests on solid, rational foundations. Dada spread from Zurich to Berlin, Cologne, Hanover, New York, and Paris. In Berlin, it took on an explicitly political edge. George Grosz and John Hartfield used photomontage to attack the Weimar establishment. In New York, Duchamp and Man Ray pushed the boundaries of what an object could mean. In Paris, the young poets who would become the Surrealists, Breton, Louis Aragon, Philippe Soupaul, encountered Dada through Tzara and recognized something essential in it. But they also recognized a limit, and the limit was this. Dada could destroy, but it could not build. It could demonstrate that meaning was fragile, that categories were arbitrary, that reason was complicit in horror. But it could not say what should replace these things. Its program was pure negation, and pure negation is, by its own logic, self-consuming. If you reject all systems of meaning, you have also rejected the system of meaning that makes your rejection intelligible. Breton grasped this clearly by 1922. He admired Dada's courage and shared its diagnosis. But he wanted something Dada could never provide, a positive project. Not a return to the old rationalism, but a new way of organizing experience that would take seriously everything reason had excluded. Dreams, coincidences, irrational desires, the strange images that surface when you stop trying to think clearly. The break between Breton and Tzara was personal and bitter, as most breaks in the avant-garde were. But the intellectual content was real. Tzara believed the only honest response to a failed civilization was perpetual demolition. Breton believed demolition was a necessary first step, but only a first step. The question was what to do after the ground is cleared. And to answer that question, Breton turned to an unlikely source, a Viennese neurologist who had never heard of him. Part 3. The First Manifesto. In October 1924, Breton published the Manifesto of Surrealism. It is one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century, and most people who cite it have never read past the definition. The definition runs as follows. Surrealism is pure psychic automatism, by which one proposes to express the real functioning of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason, exempt from aesthetic or moral preoccupation. Every word in that sentence is doing work. Pure psychic automatism means thought that runs on its own, without guidance from the conscious will. Real functioning of thought means that the automatic flow is not noise or nonsense. It is how the mind actually operates when you remove the filters that daily life requires. Absence of all control exerted by reason means that reason is not the judge of what counts as genuine thought. And exempt from aesthetic or moral preoccupation means this is not art for its own sake and not ethics. It is something prior to both. But the Manifesto does far more than define a term. Breton builds an argument in stages, and the architecture matters. He begins with a diagnosis. Adult life, he says, operates inside a cage of practical concerns. You wake up, you go to work, you manage your obligations, and the entire time your mind is running on a narrow track determined by utility. This narrow track is what we call rationality. It is not the full capacity of the mind. It is a reduction of that capacity to what is economically and socially useful. Against this reduced state, Breton places two experiences that reveal a larger capacity. The first is childhood. A child does not yet operate inside the cage. Objects shimmer with possibility. A stick is a sword, a kingdom, a person. This is not confusion. It is a mode of perception in which the mind does not yet separate the practical function of an object from its imaginative potential. The second experience is the dream. Every night, rational consciousness dissolves, and the mind produces images, narratives, connections that obey no logic the waking mind would accept. A dead friend speaks. A room is simultaneously your childhood bedroom and a train station. Emotion attaches itself to objects that waking life would call meaningless. Breton's question is devastating in its simplicity. If you spend a third of your life in this state, why should you assume the other 2/3 are more real? From this, Breton derives the central ambition of surrealism, not to choose between waking and dreaming, between reason and the unconscious, but to find the point where these opposites cease to be experienced as contradictions. He calls this point surreality. It is not a supernatural realm. It is the full spectrum of human mental experience, unified rather than divided. This is a philosophical claim, not an artistic manifesto. Breton is not saying that painters should make weird pictures. He is saying that the dominant model of the mind, the one that treats reason as the master and everything else as raw material to be processed or suppressed, is a distortion of what the mind actually is. And he is saying that the entire structure of modern civilization is built on that distortion. The manifesto ends not with a program for painting, but with examples of automatic writing, fragments of text produced by letting the hand move without direction from the will. These fragments are meant as evidence, not evidence that the results are beautiful, though Breton clearly thought they were. Evidence that when you remove rational control, what emerges is not chaos, but a different kind of order. Part 4. The Hijacking of Freud. Breton's relationship with Freud is one of the most productive misreadings in intellectual history. Breton encountered Freud's work during the war while treating psychiatric patients. The techniques of free association, dream analysis, and the concept of the unconscious became foundational to everything Surrealism would do. But Breton used Freud the way a revolutionary uses stolen weapons. He took what he needed and discarded the rest. Freud's project was therapeutic. The unconscious in Freud's model is a repository of repressed wishes, traumatic memories, and forbidden desires. These contents push their way toward the surface in disguised forms: dreams, slips of the tongue, neurotic symptoms. The goal of psychoanalysis is to bring this repressed material into consciousness so the patient can understand it, process it, and reduce its power to cause suffering. The unconscious is a problem to be solved. Breton inverted this completely. For him, the unconscious was not a problem, but a resource. Not a site of illness, but a site of truth. The images and desires that rise from beneath rational consciousness are not symptoms to be decoded and diffused. They are revelations to be received and celebrated. The divergence runs deeper than attitude. Freud believed that interpretation is everything. A dream means nothing until it is analyzed, until its manifest content, the story you remember, is traced back to its latent content, the hidden wish. The Surrealists believed interpretation was beside the point. The dream image matters as it appears, not as what it secretly stands for. A burning giraffe is not a symbol of something else. It is a burning giraffe, and the fact that the mind produced it without rational instruction is precisely what makes it significant. Freud noticed this divergence and was not pleased. When Breton visited him in Vienna in 1921, Freud was polite but unimpressed. He did not see why artists would want to valorize exactly the material that his entire career had been devoted to taming. Years later, when invited to contribute a dream to a Surrealist publication, Freud reportedly dismissed the project. He considered the surface of dreams, the part the Surrealists treasured, to be merely superficial. The important work happened underneath, in the interpretation. This disagreement is not a historical curiosity. It marks a genuine philosophical fault line that remains unresolved. Freud's position rests on a model of the mind as a hydraulic system. Pressure builds up from repressed material, and unless that pressure is managed through understanding, it produces pathology. In this model, the unconscious is subordinate to consciousness, the way a boiler room is subordinate to the building above it. The boiler matters, but you do not want to live there. Breton's position rests on a different assumption, that the unconscious is not subordinate but coordinate with consciousness, that it has its own logic, its own intelligence, its own claims to truth. And that the dominance of rational consciousness over this deeper layer is not natural or necessary, but is a cultural imposition, a product of the same civilization that produced the war. Neither position has been definitively refuted. Contemporary psychoanalysis has moved beyond Freud's hydraulic model in many respects, but the basic insight that unconscious material needs processing rather than celebration remains central to clinical practice. Meanwhile, research in cognitive science suggests that the majority of mental processing is indeed unconscious, and that conscious rational thought is a much smaller part of the picture than the Enlightenment tradition assumed. The Surrealists were wrong about many specific claims, but their intuition about the relative weight of conscious and unconscious processes has held up better than most people realize. Part 5. Automatism and the surrender of control. If the unconscious is the target, you need a method for reaching it. Automatism was the first and most radical method the Surrealists developed. The technique is deceptively simple. You sit down, you put pen to paper, and you write without stopping, without planning, without editing, as fast as your hand can move. You do not choose your words. You do not evaluate what is appearing on the page. You try, as completely as possible, to let thought run without interference from the will. Breton and Philippe Soupaul first experimented with this in 1919, producing a text called The Magnetic Fields. Breton later described the experience in terms that sound almost clinical. A monologue running at the speed of thought, with no concern for grammar, coherence, or beauty. The results were strange, vivid, unpredictable. Images collided without logical connection. A sentence about a hotel room would swerve into a sentence about a dead bird, then into a fragment about light on water. The Surrealists believed this was not randomness, but revelation. The argument was as follows. Under normal conditions, consciousness acts as a censor, selecting which thoughts to express and suppressing the rest. Automatic writing bypasses this censor the way Freud's free association bypasses it in the clinical setting. What emerges is the actual movement of the mind, uncensored and unedited. But almost immediately, problems appeared, and the problems were not minor. The first problem was practical. True automatism, if it is even possible, produces material that is often tedious. Long stretches of automatic text are not consistently startling or revealing. They contain dead patches, repetitions, banal associations. The Surrealists who produced the most compelling automatic texts, Breton included, almost certainly exercised more conscious selection than the theory permitted. The question of whether any text is genuinely automatic, or whether some degree of authorial choice inevitably shapes the result, was never fully resolved within the movement. The second problem was philosophical. If automatic writing truly bypasses conscious control, then the person who produces it cannot take credit for it. The text is not authored in any traditional sense. This was, in one sense, exactly what the Surrealists wanted. The cult of individual genius was part of the bourgeois ideology they rejected. But in practice, specific Surrealists became famous for specific texts, and the tension between the theory of anonymous unconscious expression and the reality of individual artistic reputation was never resolved. The third problem was the deepest. Automatism assumes that when you remove rational control, what emerges comes from the unconscious. But this is only true if the unconscious is a unified, coherent source. If instead the unconscious is fragmented, contradictory, shaped by cultural conditioning just as much as consciousness is, then automatic writing does not access a deeper truth. It merely reveals a different layer of the same conditioned mind. This objection was raised early, and the Surrealists never adequately answered it. Despite these problems, automatism remains one of the most radical proposals in the history of art and thought. It asks a question that no amount of philosophical argument can settle on its own. What happens when you stop controlling your mind? Not what you predict will happen, not what the theory says should happen, but what actually happens. The Surrealists insisted that the only way to find out was to try it. And whatever the limits of their theory, the results of that trying in writing, painting and drawing opened territory that had not been mapped before. Part 6. The Colliding Image. Automatism was one path to the unconscious. The Surrealist image was another, and it rested on a different mechanism entirely. The poet Pierre Revedy, writing in 1918, proposed a formula that Breton adopted and transformed. The image, Revedy said, is a pure creation of the mind. It cannot be born from a comparison, but only from the juxtaposition of two more or less distant realities. The more distant and true the relationship between the two realities, the stronger the image will be, the greater its emotional power and poetic reality. Revedy meant this as a theory of metaphor. Two things that do not normally belong together are placed side by side, and the collision between them generates meaning that neither could produce alone. A conventional metaphor reduces the distance. Saying that anger is a fire connects two things that already share obvious properties. A surrealist image maximizes the distance. Saying that a sewing machine and an umbrella meet on a dissecting table, a phrase from the 19th century writer Lautréamont that became a surrealist touchstone, connects things with no shared properties at all. But Breton did something crucial with Revedy's principle. He changed the mechanism. For Revedy, the poet consciously selects the two distant realities and places them together. The creation is deliberate. For Breton, the strongest images are those that arrive unbidden. They come to the mind spontaneously without the poet choosing them, and the fact that they were not chosen is what guarantees their depth. A deliberately constructed image, no matter how striking, remains under the control of the rational mind. An image that erupts involuntarily comes from somewhere the rational mind cannot reach. This is where the theory of the image connects back to automatism. Both propose that the most significant mental contents are the ones that appear without being summoned. But the image adds something automatism alone does not provide: a structure. An automatic text flows without form. An image, even an involuntary one, has a specific architecture. Two elements held in tension, generating a third thing that is neither one nor the other. The practical consequences for poetry were enormous. Surrealist poetry is not about themes or subjects in the way that earlier poetry was. It is about the density and strangeness of its images, the speed with which the mind is forced to leap between unrelated realities. Paul Éluard, Robert Desnos, Benjamin Péret, each of these poets developed a distinctive relationship to the surrealist image. Éluard's images tend toward luminous condensation, where the collision produces something tender and transparent. Péret's images are wilder, more violent, driven by an aggressive absurdity that refuses to settle into beauty. The same principle extended to the visual arts. Max Ernst's early collages work by the same logic. He takes images from 19th-century engravings, catalogues, and anatomical illustrations, and recombines them so that the familiar becomes uncanny. A woman's body sprouts mechanical parts. A bird-like creature presides over a geological landscape. Each collage forces the viewer to experience the collision between things that should not belong together, and the disorientation this produces is the point. The theory of the image also connects to a larger philosophical claim about meaning itself. If the most powerful meanings are generated by collisions between unrelated elements, then meaning is not a property of individual things. It is a product of relationships, and specifically of unexpected, unplanned relationships. This idea anticipated developments in structuralist linguistics, where meaning is defined by difference and relation rather than by reference to the world. The Surrealists did not make this connection explicitly, but the structural parallel is precise and documented in later scholarship by thinkers like Roman Jakobson. Part 7. The Marvelous and the Street. Surrealism is sometimes treated as a movement that turned inward, away from the world and into the private theatre of the unconscious. This is a deep misunderstanding. One of the movement's most original contributions was the insistence that the marvellous, a term they used constantly, is not inside the mind. It is on the street. The marvellous for the Surrealists was a quality of experience that emerges when the ordinary world suddenly reveals a layer of strangeness beneath its surface. Not supernatural strangeness, not fantasy. The strangeness that was always there, in the shop window, the flea market, the chance encounter on a corner. But that rational habits of perception had trained you not to notice. The primary technique for encountering the marvellous was the dérive, or what Breton and his circle simply called wandering. You walk through the city without a destination, without a purpose, with attention open to whatever presents itself. This sounds trivial. It is not. Walking with purpose means filtering the world through a single criterion. Does this get me where I'm going? Walking without purpose removes the filter and lets the city address you on its own terms. Breton's 1928 book, Nadia, is the fullest expression of this practice. It is structured around encounters that happen during urban wandering, meetings with strangers, objects found in markets, signs that seem to communicate privately to the person who notices them. The book's central figure, a young woman Breton meets on the street, becomes a kind of living emblem of the surrealist attitude. She moves through Paris as though the city were a forest of symbols, every coincidence meaningful, every object charged with personal significance. But Nadia also exposes a problem that the Surrealists never fully confronted. The real woman behind the character, Leona Delcourt, was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital shortly after her encounters with Breton. She spent the rest of her life there. Breton used her experience as material for his theory of the marvellous, but he did not save her from the system that confined her. The line between a mind open to the marvellous and a mind that has lost the ability to function in ordinary reality is not a line Surrealism ever drew clearly. Aragon's 1926 book, Paris Peasant, operates in the same territory but with a different emphasis. Where Breton finds the marvellous in encounters with people, Aragon finds it in places, specifically in the covered shopping arcades of Paris that were being demolished to make way for modern boulevards. The arcades are zones where outdated commerce produces objects that have lost their practical function and gained a dreamlike aura. A shop full of handkerchiefs becomes a meditation on desire. A barbershop becomes a portal to the unconscious. Walter Benjamin later drew heavily on Aragon's approach for his unfinished Arcades project, recognizing that the Surrealists had discovered something important about the relationship between capitalism and the dream life of a culture. The commodities that capitalism produces and then discards accumulate in overlooked spaces, and in those spaces they begin to radiate a significance that market logic never intended. Benjamin took this insight and gave it a Marxist framework, but the original discovery was surrealist. The broader principle is that the marvellous is not produced by the artist. It is already present in the world, in the gaps and margins that rational organisation overlooks. The surrealist's job is not to create, but to notice, and the most reliable way to notice is to place yourself in conditions where habitual perception breaks down. Walk without a map. Enter a shop you have no reason to enter. Follow a stranger for no reason. The world, if you stop managing your experience of it, will produce surrealist images on its own. Part 8. The Painted Unconscious. Surrealism began as a literary movement, rooted in automatic writing and the theory of the poetic image. Its extension into painting raised a question that Breton never fully resolved. Can a brush access the unconscious the way a pen can? The problem is not trivial. Writing can be fast enough to outrun conscious control. The hand moves, words appear, and the censoring faculty of the rational mind cannot keep up. Painting is slower. A canvas requires decisions about colour, composition, space. Even if the initial impulse comes from the unconscious, the execution involves deliberate choices at every stage. Two broad strategies emerged, and the tension between them defined surrealist painting for decades. The first strategy was to make painting as automatic as writing. André Masson was the central figure here. Beginning in 1923, Masson developed a technique of rapid, unplanned drawing, letting the pen move across the paper without preconception, and then discovering images in the resulting web of lines. A tangle of marks would resolve into bodies, animals, landscapes, not because Masson had planned them, but because the eye finds figures in chaos the way it finds faces in clouds. This was visual automatism, the direct translation of Breton's literary method into graphic form. The second strategy went in the opposite direction. Instead of making painting faster and more spontaneous, it made painting slower and more precise. Salvador Dalí, René Magritte, and Yves Tanguy each developed styles of extreme illusionistic clarity, rendering impossible scenes with photographic precision. A landscape melts. A pipe declares that it is not a pipe. Objects that cannot exist are painted as though they could, with every surface, shadow and texture meticulously described. This approach has a different relationship to the unconscious than automatism does. Dalí, in particular, was explicit about his method. He called it the paranoiac critical method, and it involved deliberately cultivating a state of irrational association while maintaining the technical capacity to render the results with academic precision. Where automatism tries to remove the conscious mind, the paranoiac critical method uses the conscious mind as a recording instrument for irrational content. The painter is simultaneously delirious and lucid. Magritte's project was different again. He was not interested in the unconscious in Freud's sense at all. His paintings attack the relationship between images and the things they represent. A painting of a pipe carries the inscription, "This is not a pipe." He is correct. It is not a pipe. It is a painting of a pipe. This sounds like a joke, but the philosophical content is serious and connects to problems in philosophy of language that Ludwig Wittgenstein was working on at roughly the same time. The relationship between a representation and what it represents is not natural or automatic. It is a convention, and conventions can be disrupted. Max Ernst developed yet another approach, one that generated new techniques of image production. Frottage involved placing paper over a textured surface and rubbing with a pencil to produce patterns that the artist then developed into images. Decalcomania involved pressing paint between two surfaces and peeling them apart to create unpredictable textures. In both cases, the artist introduces a mechanical element of chance into the process, producing a visual surface that was neither fully controlled nor fully random. Joan Miro occupied an intermediate position. His paintings of the mid-1920s dissolve recognizable forms into biomorphic shapes floating in color fields. They look spontaneous, but were in fact carefully composed. Miro claimed to begin in a hallucinatory state induced by hunger and exhaustion, and then to work through the resulting images over long periods of refinement. Automatism as starting point, deliberation as development. The unresolved question across all these approaches is whether painting can ever genuinely bypass consciousness the way automatic writing claims to. The physicality of the medium, its slowness and its demand for technical skill means that the painter is always making choices, even within the most spontaneous process. Some critics have argued that this makes surrealist painting a contradiction in terms, a conscious attempt to simulate unconscious production. Others have argued that the contradiction is productive, that the tension between control and its absence is exactly where the most powerful surrealist images come from. The debate remains open. Part 9. Convulsive beauty and objective chance. Breton coined several concepts that function less as definitions than as invitations to a different way of paying attention. Two of the most important are convulsive beauty and objective chance. They are connected, and the connection reveals something central about what Surrealism was trying to do. Convulsive beauty is Breton's term for the specific type of aesthetic experience Surrealism values. The phrase first appears as the final sentence of Nadja. Beauty will be convulsive or will not be at all. In his 1937 book Mad Love, Breton elaborated the concept into three components. First, beauty should be veiled erotic. It should carry a sexual charge that is suggested but not explicit, present but partially hidden. Second, beauty should be fixed, explosive. It should contain the impression of a dynamic force, frozen in a single instant, like a photograph of a movement you cannot see with the naked eye. Third, beauty should be magic circumstantial. It should seem to respond to a need you did not know you had, as though the world arranged itself to address you personally. The common element in all three is that convulsive beauty is not calm contemplation. It is a disruption. It jolts the nervous system the way an unexpected touch does. This is Breton's deliberate rejection of the classical aesthetic tradition, running from Kant through much of the 19th century, which located beauty in harmony, balance, and disinterested pleasure. For Breton, disinterested pleasure is not beauty. It is decoration. Real beauty seizes you, shakes something loose in the structure of your perception, and leaves you different from how it found you. Objective chance is the companion concept. It names those moments when an external event coincides with an internal desire, in a way that no rational explanation can account for. You are thinking about someone you have not seen in years, and they telephone. You need a particular book and find it by accident on a stranger's shelf. You turn a corner and see a face that answers a question you had not yet formulated. The standard rationalist response is coincidence. These things happen by chance, and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness does the rest. Breton's response was more nuanced than it is usually given credit for. He did not claim that objective chance was supernatural. He claimed that it revealed a zone where the inner world and the outer world are not as separate as rational analysis insists. Your desire does not cause the telephone to ring, but the fact that the telephone rings at the exact moment of your desire exposes a relationship between inner and outer experience that the rational framework has no category for. This concept draws on Hegel and on Engels, both of whom use the term objective chance in different ways. But Breton's usage is distinctive. He locates the philosophical significance of chance not in what it tells us about the structure of the world, but in what it tells us about the structure of desire. Objective chance, for Breton, is evidence that desire extends beyond the individual mind. It is a force that shapes encounters, and the encounters it shapes reveal needs that conscious introspection alone could never identify. Mad love develops this into a theory of erotic fate. Breton describes his meeting with his second wife, Jacqueline Lambert, as a series of coincidences so improbable that they seem to demand explanation beyond statistics. A poem he wrote years earlier appears to prophesy the encounter in specific detail. The encounter itself unfolds as though scripted by a logic that is neither rational nor irrational, but operates at a level where the distinction does not apply. The obvious critique is confirmation bias. We remember the coincidences that match our desires and forget the thousands that do not. Breton was aware of this objection and never fully refuted it. His implicit response was that the phenomenon matters even if the explanation is uncertain. Whether or not objective chance reveals a hidden order, the experience of it, the jolt of recognition when the world seems to answer your desire, is real and irreducible. And any theory of experience that ignores it is incomplete. Part 10. The Surrealist Object. By the early 1930s, Surrealism had produced a substantial body of writing and painting. But Breton was increasingly drawn to a different medium, one that occupied a strange territory between art and something else entirely. the Surrealist object. The concept evolved through several stages. Duchamp's ready-mades had already demonstrated that an ordinary manufactured object, removed from its functional context and placed in a gallery, could provoke a crisis in the category of art. But Duchamp's gesture was conceptual and cool. The Surrealist object aimed at something warmer and more disturbing. In 1931, Dali proposed the category of the symbolically functioning object. These were assembled from found materials and arranged to embody a specific desire, usually erotic, in material form. A shoe, a glass of warm milk, a piece of sugar, a spoon, combined into a configuration that makes no practical sense but produces a definite psychological effect. The object does not represent desire. It materializes it. You feel something in its presence that you cannot feel looking at a painting of the same arrangement. This matters because it crosses a boundary that painting and writing do not. A painting exists in a frame, separated from the space you inhabit. A poem exists on a page, inside the conventions of reading. A surrealist object sits on a table in your room, occupying the same physical space you do. It refuses the distinction between art and life that galleries and books enforce. Other types of surrealist objects followed. Found objects, ordinary things whose shape or texture suggested irrational significance. Natural objects that seemed to have been designed by an unconscious intelligence, a root that looked like a hand, a stone that resembled a face. Interpreted found objects, where the discoverer adds a minimal alteration that transforms the meaning without erasing the original identity. And phantom objects, things that appeared in dreams and were then constructed in waking life, dragging them across the border between the two states. Meret Oppenheim's fur-covered cup, saucer and spoon from 1936, titled Object, is the most famous surrealist object and illustrates the principle with precision. A cup is something you bring to your lips. Fur is something you touch with your skin. Combining them produces an object that simultaneously invites and repels physical contact. The response it provokes is bodily, not intellectual. You feel a shudder before you think a thought. This is exactly the register Surrealism was trying to reach, the zone where meaning is produced below the level of rational processing. The surrealist object also connects to a broader critique of commodity culture. Capitalism produces objects designed to satisfy defined needs. A surrealist object is designed to activate undefined desires. It is useless in every practical sense, but it is not functionless. Its function is to disrupt the circuit of rational need and rational satisfaction that commodity culture depends on. In this way, the surrealist object is already a political gesture, even before any manifesto explains why. Part 11. Revolution and the Party. From very early on, Breton insisted that Surrealism was not just an art movement, but a revolutionary project. This was not metaphorical. He meant political revolution in the Marxist sense, the overthrow of capitalist society. The question was how an enterprise devoted to the liberation of the unconscious could align with a political movement devoted to the transformation of economic relations. The answer turned out to be with enormous difficulty and eventual catastrophe. The logic of the alignment was clear in principle. Surrealism claimed that rational bourgeois consciousness was a cage that suppressed deeper human capacities. Marxism claimed that bourgeois society was a structure that suppressed the working class. Both identified the same enemy, bourgeois civilization, and both demanded its total transformation. Breton argued that these two liberations, the liberation of the mind and the liberation of the worker, were not separate projects, but two aspects of a single revolution. In January 1927, 5 members of the Surrealist group, including Breton, Aragon and Eluard, joined the French Communist Party. Others, including Desnos and Miro, refused. Even among those who joined, the relationship was strained from the beginning. Breton found party meetings excruciating. He was once asked to give a report on the economic situation in Italy to a cell of gas workers and found the task absurd. The party found the Surrealists equally absurd. From the PCF's perspective, art that explored the unconscious was at best irrelevant to the class struggle and at worst a bourgeois indulgence. The Soviet cultural line, increasingly dominant in the international communist movement, demanded socialist realism, art that depicted workers and their struggles in clear, accessible, ideologically correct terms. Surrealism was the opposite of this in every respect. The tension escalated throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. Aragon travelled to the Soviet Union in 1930 with his partner Elsa Triolet and came back a committed Stalinist. He wrote a poem, Red Front, that called on soldiers to disobey their officers and included lines calling for the deaths of political enemies. When Aragon was prosecuted for the poem, the Surrealists defended him. But Aragon's political trajectory was already diverging from theirs. By 1932, he had fully committed to the PCF line and renounced Surrealism. Breton was expelled from the party in 1933. The ostensible reasons were various, but the real reason was structural. The PCF demanded obedience to the party line on all questions, including cultural questions. Breton demanded that the Surrealists retain complete independence in their artistic practice. These two demands could not coexist. What followed was a slow, painful process of political realignment. Breton maintained his commitment to revolution, but increasingly identified with the anti-Stalinist left. In 1938, he travelled to Mexico and met Leon Trotsky. Together, they drafted a manifesto for an independent revolutionary art, which argued that genuine revolutionary art requires complete creative freedom, and that any party that suppresses this freedom betrays the revolution it claims to serve. The manifesto was signed by Breton and the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, though Trotsky was the co-author. The deeper problem was one that Breton acknowledged but never solved. Surrealism claims to liberate the individual mind. Marxism claims to liberate a class, which requires collective discipline and organizational structures that constrain individual freedom. These two forms of liberation pull in opposite directions. You can have an avant-garde movement devoted to psychic freedom, or you can have a political party devoted to class struggle. But combining the two requires sacrifices that neither side was willing to make. The political legacy is therefore mixed. The Surrealist critique of bourgeois consciousness remains one of the most radical analyses of ideology ever produced. The attempt to embed that critique within an organized political movement failed. And the failure was not accidental. It was built into the structure of the project from the beginning. Part 12. The Second Manifesto and the Purges. In December 1929, Breton published the Second Manifesto of Surrealism in the final issue of La Révolution Surrealiste. It is a very different document from the first. Where the 1924 manifesto was expansive and inviting, the Second Manifesto is combative, accusatory, and at times vicious. The philosophical content, however, is significant. Breton introduces a concept that reframes the entire project. He writes that everything leads us to believe there exists a certain point of the mind at which life and death, the real and the imagined, past and future, the communicable and the incommunicable, high and low, cease to be perceived as contradictions. The entire activity of surrealism, he says, is devoted to finding and fixing this point. This is a more ambitious claim than anything in the first manifesto. In 1924, the goal was to access the unconscious and integrate it with waking experience. In 1929, the goal is to locate a point of absolute convergence, where all the fundamental oppositions that structure human experience collapse into unity. This is a claim with roots in Hegel's dialectic, in mystical traditions that Breton was reading with increasing seriousness, and in the alchemical tradition of the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites. But the Second Manifesto is remembered at least as much for its purges as for its philosophy. Breton had already expelled Antonin Artaud, Philippe Soupault, and Roger Vitrac in 1926. By 1929, he had decided that another purge was necessary. He sent a letter to everyone associated with the movement asking them to commit to collective action. He already knew who would respond favourably. The letter was a mechanism for identifying and removing those who would not. The Second Manifesto names its targets with extraordinary hostility. Former allies are accused of betrayal, opportunism, careerism, and moral cowardice. Breton writes in a tone that resembles a Stalinist denunciation, and the parallel is not lost on those who were expelled. The expelled members responded with a collectively authored pamphlet titled A Corpse, turning the title of the Surrealists' own 1924 pamphlet attacking the writer Anatole France back against Breton. They accused him of behaving like a pope or a police chief, demanding obedience rather than creative freedom. The charge has stuck. Breton's authoritarianism is one of the most persistent criticisms of surrealism as a movement, and the evidence for it is substantial. The question is whether the authoritarianism was incidental or structural. Was Breton simply a difficult personality who drove people away, or does something about the Surrealist project itself require centralized control? There is an argument for the structural interpretation. Surrealism, unlike Dada, had a positive program. It made specific claims about the unconscious, about the image, about the relationship between psychic liberation and political revolution. These claims could be implemented correctly or incorrectly, which means they required someone to judge which implementations were legitimate and which were deviations. A movement with doctrines inevitably produces a guardian of those doctrines, and that guardian inevitably acquires the power to excommunicate. Dada avoided this problem by having no positive doctrine to enforce. But Dada also dissolved within a few years. Surrealism survived for decades, partly because Breton's centralized authority maintained coherence that pure anarchic creativity would have dispersed. The cost of coherence was repression. The cost of avoiding repression, as Dada demonstrated, was dissolution. Neither outcome is clean, and the tension between creative freedom and organizational structure is one that every collective artistic project eventually confronts. The second manifesto also marks a shift in the movement's intellectual alliances. Breton explicitly aligns surrealism with dialectical materialism, claiming that the movement shares Marxism's starting point in the failure of the Hegelian system. This was partly genuine philosophical conviction and partly a bid for political legitimacy during a period when the Surrealists were trying and failing to maintain their relationship with the Communist Party. The result was a movement that was simultaneously too radical for the party and too authoritarian for many of its own members. This double bind would define the politics of surrealism for the rest of its existence. Part 13. Bataille and the Dissident Current. The most serious intellectual challenge surrealism ever faced did not come from its critics outside the movement. It came from within, or rather from its immediate border, from Georges Bataille. Bataille was not a surrealist, though he moved in the same circles and shared many of the same interests. He was something more dangerous to Breton's project, an alternative version of it. The disagreement was not about personality, though the personal hostility was real. It was about the direction you go when you leave rational consciousness behind. Breton wanted to go up. Bataille wanted to go down. Breton's surrealism, for all its radicalism, retained an idealist structure. The unconscious, in his account, is a source of beauty, revelation, and higher truth. The marvelous is elevated, luminous, charged with erotic promise. The surrealist image lifts the mind toward a point where contradictions resolve. This is fundamentally a movement of ascent, from the mundane to the marvelous, from ordinary consciousness to something greater. Bataille rejected this structure root and branch. He argued that Breton's surrealism was not a genuine escape from idealism, but its latest disguise. By treating the unconscious as a source of beauty and higher meaning, Breton was doing exactly what the philosophical tradition had always done, taking raw, disruptive material and sublimating it, transforming it into something acceptable, presentable, reconciled. Against this, Bataille proposed what he called base materialism. The term is precise. It does not mean ordinary materialism, the philosophical position that everything is made of matter. It means a materialism that insists on the low, the repulsive, the unrecoverable. Excrement, decomposition, the sacrificial wound, the moment of orgasm as a dissolution of selfhood rather than a peak of pleasure. These experiences, Bataille argued, are not raw materials waiting to be transformed into meaning. They are irreducible realities that resist every attempt to give them form or purpose. Bataille developed these ideas through documents, the journal he edited from 1929 to 1930. The journal functioned as an anti-surrealist weapon, though its contributors included former surrealists like André Masson and Michel Leiris. Documents combined ethnography, art criticism and photography in combinations designed to disturb rather than illuminate. An essay on the human foot might sit next to photographs of slaughterhouses. The juxtapositions were surrealist in technique, but anti-surrealist in spirit. Where surrealist juxtaposition aims to produce a spark of new meaning, Bataille's juxtapositions aim to produce collapse, to show that meaning itself is unstable and that beneath every system of order lies something that order cannot contain. Breton's response in the second manifesto was vicious. He accused Bataille of wanting to consider only what is vilest, most discouraging and most corrupted in the world. The accusation missed the point. Bataille was not celebrating degradation for its own sake. He was arguing that any theory of experience, including surrealism, that systematically excludes the low and the repulsive, is not radical at all. It is merely a more sophisticated version of the same civilizing project that suppresses whatever threatens its self-image. This debate has not been settled. In the decades since, Bataille's influence has in some ways overtaken Breton's in academic and theoretical circles. His ideas about transgression, excess, and the sacred informed the work of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, and the post-structuralist tradition more broadly. But the question he raised against Breton, whether the unconscious is a source of higher meaning or an abyss that resists meaning altogether, remains one of the deepest unresolved questions in the philosophy of mind and the theory of art. Part 14. The Ethnographic Temptation. Surrealism had a complicated relationship with non-Western cultures, and the complications matter because they expose a tension at the heart of the project. From the beginning, the Surrealists were drawn to objects from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. Breton, Éluard, and Aragon were all collectors of what the period called primitive art. These objects fascinated them precisely because they seemed to come from cultures where the boundary between the rational and the irrational, between the practical world and the dream world, had never been drawn in the way European civilization drew it. This fascination was not mere exoticism, though exoticism was always part of it. The Surrealists genuinely believed that non-Western cultures had preserved modes of experience that European rationalism had destroyed, and that contact with these modes could help repair what the Enlightenment had broken. African masks, oceanic carvings, Mesoamerican sculptures, these were not decorative objects to the Surrealists. They were evidence that other relationships between consciousness and the world were possible. The problem is one that James Clifford identified in his influential 1981 essay on ethnographic surrealism. The Surrealists used non-Western objects to destabilize Western categories of thought, which was genuinely subversive. But they did so without seriously engaging with the cultures that produced those objects. An African mask in Breton's studio was not understood through the ritual context in which it functioned. It was understood through surrealist categories, as evidence of the marvelous, as proof that the unconscious could take material form. The object was uprooted from its own system of meaning and inserted into a European theoretical framework. This is not a minor objection. It goes to the heart of Surrealism's claim to challenge Western rationalism. If your method of challenging Western categories involves appropriating the products of other cultures and reading them through your own categories, then you have not escaped the structure you claim to oppose. You have extended it. The connection between surrealism and ethnography was institutional as well as intellectual. Several members of the broader surrealist orbit, particularly Michel Leiris, participated in the Dakar-Djibouti ethnographic mission of 1931 to 1933, one of the major French anthropological expeditions of the period. Leiris went expecting to encounter the kind of unmediated contact with the other that surrealism promised. What he found was the apparatus of colonial power, and his subsequent writings, particularly his memoir Phantom Africa, document his disillusionment with both the expedition and the surrealist fantasy that inspired his participation. Bataille's Documents journal complicated the picture further. Its subtitle was Doctrines, Archaeology, Fine Arts, Ethnography, and it juxtaposed Western and non-Western images in ways designed to undermine the hierarchy between them. But, as Clifford argued, even this more critical engagement remained trapped within a European frame. The non-Western object functioned as a tool for disrupting European certainties, which means it was still being instrumentalized, used for a purpose defined by Europeans. The most honest position within surrealism on this question came later from surrealists working outside Europe like Aimé Césaire and Wilfredo Lam, who could use surrealist techniques without the same structure of appropriation because the non-Western material they drew on was their own. But that story belongs to a later part. Within European surrealism, the ethnographic temptation was never fully resolved, and it remains one of the movement's most productive failures, a point where surrealism's own methods can be turned against its assumptions. Part 15. The Camera and the Cut. Surrealism found in cinema something it could not find in any other medium: the ability to make the viewer experience time the way the unconscious processes it. In a painting, you stand outside the image. In a poem, you supply your own mental imagery. In a film, the image is given to you, and it moves, and the movement carries you forward at a pace you do not control. This is closer to the structure of a dream than any static medium can achieve. In dreams, images succeed each other with a logic that is not logical, and you cannot stop the flow to analyze what is happening. Film does the same thing. Un Chien Andalou, made in 1929 by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dalí, is the founding document of surrealist cinema. The two collaborators agreed on a principle: no image or sequence should be explicable through rational association. If either of them could identify a symbolic meaning in a proposed shot, the shot was cut. What remained was a chain of images linked by emotional and associative force, rather than narrative logic. The film opens with one of the most infamous sequences in the history of cinema. A man sharpens a razor. A cloud crosses the moon. The razor slices an eye. The image is almost unbearable, and that is the point. It attacks the viewer's visual faculty directly, forcing an experience that the conscious mind cannot process quickly enough to defend against. You react physically before you react intellectually. This is the surrealist image translated into the time-based medium that can most fully exploit it. Buñuel continued this work in L'Âge d'Or the following year, a feature-length film that extends the surrealist method into a sustained assault on bourgeois morality, the Catholic Church, and the institution of the family. The film provoked riots at its Paris screening. Fascist groups attacked the theatre and destroyed artworks displayed in the lobby. The film was banned and remained largely unavailable for decades. Photography occupied a different position. Man Ray, Brassai, and later Lee Miller developed photographic techniques that brought surrealist principles into the medium of mechanical reproduction. Man Ray's rayographs, made by placing objects directly on photographic paper and exposing them to light, produced images without a camera, images that recorded the presence of an object without representing it in the ordinary sense. Brassai's nighttime photographs of Paris captured the city as a surrealist landscape, where shadows, reflections, and empty streets produced the atmosphere of the marvellous without any manipulation. Photography raised a specific theoretical question for surrealism. A photograph records what is actually there. It is, by its nature, indexical, a trace of the real. This means that when a photograph produces a surrealist effect, the strangeness cannot be dismissed as fantasy or invention. It is documented reality that happens to look impossible. Breton recognized this and used photographs extensively in Nadia and Mad Love, embedding them in the text as evidence that the marvellous exists in the world and can be mechanically recorded. Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, made in 1943 in Los Angeles, represents perhaps the most sophisticated development of surrealist cinema. Where Buñuel's method is aggressive and confrontational, Deren's is internal and subjective. The film places the viewer inside a single consciousness as it moves between waking and dreaming, using repetition, temporal loops, and shifts in spatial logic to create the experience of a mind that can no longer distinguish between what it imagines and what it perceives. Deren's work also marks a crucial extension of surrealism beyond the Parisian circle and into American experimental film, where its influence would prove as durable as anything the original movement produced. Part 16. Games, Chance, and Collective Creation. Surrealism was not only a theory or a body of artworks. It was also a set of practices, many of them collective, designed to produce results that no individual mind could generate alone. The most famous of these is the exquisite corpse. The procedure is simple. One person draws or writes on a sheet of paper, folds it to conceal what they have done, and passes it to the next person, who continues without seeing what came before. The result is a composite image or sentence that no single participant intended. It is authored by the group and by chance, not by any individual will. The name itself comes from the first sentence produced by this method. The exquisite corpse shall drink the new wine. The sentence is startling, and its strangeness is not decorative. It demonstrates the surrealist principle that removing individual authorial control produces images that are more charged, more unexpected, and more revealing than anything deliberate effort can achieve. Other games followed the same logic. In one, participants would pose a question and answer it separately, without seeing the other's contribution, then read the two together. In another, they would describe objects in sealed envelopes and then combine the descriptions into composite objects that could not exist. Each game was a miniature experiment in automatism, designed to produce the collision of unrelated mental contents that Breton's theory of the image identified as the source of poetic power. The philosophical stakes of these practices are higher than they appear. The exquisite corpse is not just a parlour game. It is a practical test of a specific hypothesis. That meaning can emerge without intention. If a composite sentence produced by three people who cannot see each other's work turns out to be striking, evocative, resonant, then the source of that meaning cannot be the conscious purpose of any individual author. It must come from somewhere else, from the combinatorial properties of language itself, from the unconscious associations that different minds share, or from the role that chance plays in generating patterns that rational planning would never produce. This connects to a broader question about creativity that the Surrealists posed but did not answer. Is creative work fundamentally an individual act of genius, as the Romantic tradition claimed? Or is it a process that can be distributed across multiple agents, including agents who do not intend anything at all, like chance, like the fold in the paper that separates one drawing from the next? The Surrealist games suggest the second answer. They propose that the individual author is not the necessary condition of meaningful creation, but an obstacle to it. This idea would later be developed in very different vocabularies by Roland Barthes in his essay on the death of the author, and by generative and algorithmic art practices that use rule-based systems to produce visual and textual outputs without a single controlling intelligence. The Surrealists did not anticipate these developments explicitly, but the structural logic is continuous. Part 17. The women the movement could not contain. Surrealism's theory of the feminine is one of the most revealing contradictions in the movement's history. It reveals the gap between Surrealism's radical ambitions and the conventional assumptions that survived inside them. In Breton's writing, woman occupies a central role, but it is a role defined entirely by the male gaze. She is the muse, the mediating figure who connects the male artist to the unconscious. She is the object of mad love, the encounter that shatters rational categories. She is the embodiment of the marvellous. What she is not, in Breton's framework, is a subject in her own right, with her own unconscious, her own creative project, her own relationship to the surreal. Nadia is the clearest example. Breton presents the woman he calls Nadia as a living embodiment of surrealist experience. She sees signs everywhere. She lives without boundaries between dream and waking. She is the surrealist ideal made flesh. But when her psychological state deteriorates into what institutional psychiatry calls madness, Breton withdraws. The real woman, Léona Delcourt, was committed to a psychiatric hospital. Breton did not intervene on her behalf. He moved on to his next love. The woman who had served as the incarnation of his theory was abandoned when she ceased to serve that function. This pattern was structural, not incidental. The Surrealist theory of inspiration required a feminine figure who mediated between the conscious and unconscious minds. But this mediating role was passive. The woman is acted upon, observed, desired, narrated. She is not the one who writes, who paints, who theorizes. The women who did write and paint and theorize within or alongside Surrealism understood this problem and addressed it, though the forms of their address varied enormously. Leonora Carrington, who entered the Surrealist circle through her relationship with Max Ernst, rapidly outgrew the role of muse. Her fiction and painting draw on Celtic mythology, alchemical symbolism, and a specifically feminine, magical tradition that has nothing to do with Breton's theory of feminine mediation. Her novel The Hearing Trumpet, written in the 1950s, imagines elderly women as agents of cosmic transformation, inverting every surrealist convention about youth, beauty, and passive femininity. Remedios Varo, working in Mexico after fleeing wartime Europe, developed an intricate visual vocabulary in which women are not objects of the male gaze, but scientists, alchemists, navigators of cosmic machinery. Her paintings depict female figures who are builders and discoverers, embedded in systems of esoteric knowledge that they control rather than embody. Claude Cahun, working primarily through photographic self-portraiture, attacked the question at its root. Cahun's self-portraits do not present a stable identity to be desired or interpreted. They present identity as an unstable construction, a series of masks with no authentic face beneath them. This was a direct challenge to Surrealism's essentialist account of femininity, and it anticipated by decades the theories of gender performativity that Judith Butler would later develop in academic philosophy. Dorothea Tanning, Kay Sage, Leonore Finney, Merritt Oppenheim, Toyen, each of these artists engaged with surrealist ideas while refusing the position that surrealist theory assigned to women. Finney painted male nudes in which men became the objects of the female gaze, reversing the standard surrealist dynamic. Oppenheim's fur-covered cup, as discussed earlier, was made by a woman, but is almost always discussed in terms defined by men, as though the object's meaning exists independently of the person who made it. The broader scholarly reassessment of women in Surrealism, driven by Whitney Chadwick's foundational 1985 study and expanded in exhibitions and publications over the past 2 decades, has established that the women were not marginal participants in a male movement. They were artists who used Surrealist tools to produce work that Surrealist theory could not fully account for. And the gap between what the tools could do and what the theory permitted reveals Surrealism's deepest unexamined assumption, that the unconscious speaks through women but belongs to men. Part 18. Surrealism Beyond Europe. Surrealism was born in Paris, but it did not stay there. And in many of its most significant extensions, it became something its European founders had not intended and could not fully control. The Caribbean was the site of the most radical transformation. When Breton fled Europe during the Second World War, his ship stopped in Martinique in 1941. There he encountered Aimé Césaire, who was already developing a literary and political project that would become the Negritude movement. Césaire had read Breton and found in Surrealism a method for doing something Breton had never imagined, using the liberation of the unconscious as a weapon against colonial oppression. The logic was precise. Colonial education imposed European rationalism on colonized peoples as a condition of acceptance. To be civilized meant to think, speak, and create according to European norms. This meant that the colonized subject's own cultural inheritance, the oral traditions, spiritual practices, and aesthetic forms of African-descended Caribbean peoples was classified as primitive, irrational, pre-modern. Surrealism's insistence that the irrational is not inferior to the rational, but is in fact a deeper and more authentic mode of experience, gave Césaire a framework for reclaiming what colonialism had degraded. But Césaire did not simply adopt Surrealism. he transformed it. His 1939 poem Notebook of a Return to the Native Land uses surrealist techniques, the colliding image, the flow of uncontrolled association, the eruption of material that rational discourse suppresses. But it directs these techniques toward a subject that Parisian surrealism had never taken seriously: the lived experience of colonized black people. The unconscious that speaks in Césaire's work is not the private unconscious of a European intellectual. It is the collective unconscious of a people whose history was violently suppressed. Wilfredo Lam, a Cuban painter of African and Chinese descent, performed a parallel transformation in the visual arts. Lam met both Picasso and Breton in Paris, absorbed Surrealist and Cubist techniques, and then returned to Cuba in 1941 after meeting Césaire in Martinique. His masterpiece, The Jungle, painted in 1943, fuses Surrealist automatism with the imagery of Afro-Caribbean religion, Santeria and Vodou, to produce a work that is simultaneously a Surrealist painting and a decolonial statement. The figures in The Jungle are not European dream images projected onto a tropical landscape. They are embodiments of syncretic spiritual traditions that already operated in the zone between the rational and the irrational that Breton surrealism could only theorize. In Mexico, the encounter between surrealism and local culture took a different form. Breton visited Mexico in 1938 and declared it the most surrealist country on earth, a statement that revealed more about his projections than about Mexico. But Mexico did become a genuine centre of surrealist practice, partly because wartime exile brought European surrealists there, and partly because Mexican culture, with its traditions of magical realism, syncretic religion and revolutionary politics, offered conditions that European surrealism found only in theory. Carrington and Varro, both exiles in Mexico City, produced their most significant work there, in a context that nourished rather than constrained their vision. In Egypt, the Art and Liberty Group, founded in 1938 under the partial influence of Surrealism, developed a practice that was simultaneously surrealist and anti-colonial, directing the movement's methods against British imperial power. In Japan, Surrealism took root in the 1920s and produced a distinctive visual and literary tradition that intersected with indigenous aesthetic concepts. In each case, Surrealism was not exported from Paris to a passive periphery. It was taken up, transformed, and turned toward purposes that the Parisian centre had not envisioned. The pattern here is important for understanding what Surrealism actually was. If it were merely a style, these extensions would be imitations. The fact that they are not, the fact that Surrealist techniques could be used to address anti-colonial struggle, syncretic spirituality, and non-European modes of consciousness suggests that the techniques touched something real, something that was not limited to the cultural conditions of interwar Paris. Part 19. War, Exile, and the American Encounter. The Second World War dispersed surrealism across the globe, and the encounter with the United States proved to be one of the most consequential and most ambivalent episodes in the movement's history. As German forces advanced across Europe, the Surrealists fled. Breton, Ernst, Masson, Tanguy, Dali and others arrived in New York between 1940 and 1942. They came as refugees, carrying the prestige of the European avant-garde, and the young American painters who encountered them were profoundly affected. The impact was specific and traceable. Jackson Pollock attended Surrealist exhibitions and was directly influenced by Masson's automatic drawing technique. Robert Motherwell studied with the Surrealist Roberto Matta and absorbed the theory of automatism. Arshile Gorky developed a style that hovered between Surrealist biomorphism and what would become abstract expressionism. The American painters took from Surrealism its emphasis on the unconscious, its commitment to spontaneous process, and its rejection of representational conventions. What they rejected was the literary and theoretical apparatus, the manifestos, the doctrine, the group identity, the political commitments. This selective inheritance created a peculiar situation. Abstract expressionism, the movement that emerged from this encounter, is in many respects surrealism, stripped of everything except automatism. Pollock's drip paintings are automatic drawing carried to its logical extreme, a practice in which the painter's body moves across the canvas without predetermined design, producing configurations that no deliberate method could achieve. But Pollock and his contemporaries had no interest in Breton's theory of the marvellous, his concept of objective chance, his political programme, or his insistence that the unconscious carries specific, communicable content. For the Americans, the unconscious was a source of energy and form, not a source of meaning. Breton in New York was a tragic figure in some respects. He refused to learn English, continued to operate as though Paris were the centre of the cultural world, and found the American art scene both stimulating and alien. He organised exhibitions and published the journal VVV, which brought surrealist ideas to American audiences. But the Americans who absorbed those ideas were not interested in joining a movement under Breton's leadership. They wanted the tools, not the doctrine. The Exile years also produced important theoretical developments. Breton's 1942 prolegomena to a third manifesto of Surrealism, though never developed into a full document, introduced the concept of the Great Transparence, a speculative proposal that human beings might be part of a larger order of beings who are to us what we are to animals, invisible not because they are hidden, but because our perceptual apparatus is too limited to detect them. This is Breton at his most speculative, and the idea has been dismissed by some as mystical indulgence. But it connects to a genuine philosophical question about the limits of perception and the possibility that reality extends beyond what any given mode of consciousness can access. After the war, Breton returned to Paris. The Surrealist movement reconstituted itself, but the centre of gravity in the art world had shifted to New York. The Americans had taken what they needed and built something new with it. Surrealism continued as an organised movement for another 2 decades, but its relationship to the cutting edge of contemporary art was never the same. Part 20. Surrealism after Breton. Breton died on September 28, 1966. The Surrealist group in Paris continued for another 3 years before dissolving itself in 1969. But the question of what Surrealism became after Breton is not a question about the group. It is a question about the ideas. The Situationist International, founded by Guy Debord in 1957, represents the most direct political heir. Debord had absorbed Surrealism's critique of bourgeois consciousness, but concluded that the Surrealists had failed to carry their revolution far enough. The dérive, the practice of urban wandering that the Surrealists had pioneered, became a central situationist technique. but Debord stripped it of its mystical overtones and framed it as an explicitly political practice, a way of analysing the psychic effects of urban space, rather than discovering the marvellous within it. The concept of the spectacle, Debord's central theoretical contribution, extends the surrealist insight that capitalism colonizes not just labour but consciousness itself, producing a world in which images replace lived experience. The Fluxus movement of the 1960s drew on surrealist game structures and the exquisite corpse tradition to develop participatory event-based art that dissolved the boundary between artist and audience. Conceptual art owed a specific debt to Duchamp's ready-mades, which are inextricable from the surrealist context in which they developed, even though Duchamp himself kept the movement at arm's length. In literature, the surrealist legacy is enormous and diffuse. The magical realism of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, and other Latin American writers draws directly on surrealist techniques of juxtaposition and the integration of dream logic into narrative prose. The post-war French novel, particularly the work of Alain Robbe-Grillet and the Nouveau Roman, reacted against surrealism, but did so in terms surrealism had defined. You cannot reject the privileging of the unconscious without acknowledging that someone established it as a starting point. In film, Buñuel continued making surrealist cinema for decades after leaving the movement, producing masterworks through the 1970s that extended the methods he had pioneered in 1929. David Lynch, the most significant inheritor of surrealist cinema in the American tradition, has built an entire body of work around the principle that narrative should follow the logic of dreams rather than the logic of events. Lynch has never claimed the surrealist label, but the structural DNA is unmistakable. In philosophy and critical theory, surrealism's afterlife is equally pervasive. Foucault's early work on madness and reason engages directly with surrealism's challenge to the rational-irrational boundary. Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome, a structure of thought that grows without hierarchy or centre, echoes the surrealist commitment to non-hierarchical mental association. Derrida's practice of deconstruction, which identifies internal contradictions within apparently stable systems of meaning, has structural parallels with the surrealist image, which produces meaning through the collision of incompatible elements. The question is whether these extensions are surrealism or something else. The answer depends on whether you define surrealism by its institutional form, the group, the manifestos, the purges, or by its intellectual core, the claim that rational consciousness is a reduction of the mind's full capacity, and that techniques exist for accessing what it excludes. If you use the first definition, surrealism ended in 1969. If you use the second, it has not ended at all. Part 21. The Strongest Objections. Surrealism has been criticized from nearly every direction, and intellectual honesty requires presenting those criticisms at full strength before assessing what survives them. The first and most persistent objection is that automatism does not work. The claim that writing or drawing without conscious control accesses a deeper layer of the mind assumes that such a layer exists as a coherent source, and that it produces meaningful content when accessed. Neither assumption is self-evident. If you analyze automatic texts closely, many of them show patterns, stylistic habits, lexical preferences that belong to the specific author who produced them. This suggests that what automatism accesses is not the unconscious in some universal sense, but the idiosyncratic reservoir of a particular trained mind. In the strongest version of this critique, automatism is not a discovery, but a performance, a simulation of spontaneity that conceals the degree of authorial selection involved. The second objection is political. The Surrealists claim to be revolutionaries, but their revolution never escaped the café and the gallery. Working-class movements found Surrealist art incomprehensible and irrelevant to their material struggles. The PCF's dismissal of Surrealism as bourgeois indulgence was crude, but it contained a real insight. A revolution in consciousness that never connects to a revolution in economic and social structures is not a revolution at all. It is a lifestyle. The third objection concerns the treatment of women, addressed in detail earlier, but worth restating as a structural critique. Surrealism claimed to liberate the mind from bourgeois conventions, yet it reproduced one of the deepest bourgeois conventions of all, the assignment of women to the role of inspiring object rather than creative subject. This is not a failure of individual surrealists who happen to be sexist. It is a failure built into the theory, which defined the unconscious as something accessed through the encounter with a feminized other, rather than through the independent activity of any mind, regardless of gender. The fourth objection comes from philosophy of mind and targets the concept of the unconscious itself. The Surrealists relied on a broadly Freudian model in which the unconscious is a structured domain with specific contents that can be brought to the surface through specific techniques. But the cognitive sciences have complicated this picture considerably. There is no single entity called the unconscious. There are multiple unconscious processes: perceptual, motor, associative, emotional, each operating according to different principles and located in different neural systems. The Surrealist unconscious, conceived as a unified reservoir of suppressed desires and images waiting to erupt into consciousness, does not correspond to anything that current science identifies. The fifth objection is aesthetic, and comes from modernists who shared Surrealism's rejection of convention, but not its methods. Clement Greenberg argued that Surrealism, by retaining representational imagery and literary content, failed to pursue the logic of modernism, which demanded that each art form explore what was unique to its own medium, rather than importing content from other domains. Painting, in Greenberg's view, should explore flatness, colour, and the properties of the canvas, not illustrate dream narratives. This critique was itself later challenged, but it shaped the reception of Surrealist painting for decades and contributed to its relative critical neglect in the mid-20th century. The sixth objection is the charge of appropriation, covered in the discussion of ethnographic surrealism. The Surrealists use non-Western cultures as a mirror for their own fantasies about the irrational, extracting formal and emotional properties from objects while ignoring the cultural systems that produce them. This critique has gained force in the post-colonial period and represents one of the areas where Surrealism's legacy is most contested. Against each of these objections, defences exist, and some are strong. Against the automatism critique, defenders argue that the value of the technique does not depend on whether it truly bypasses consciousness, but on whether it produces results that conscious deliberation cannot. If automatic writing generates images and connections that surprise even the writer, the theoretical explanation matters less than the practical outcome. Against the political critique, defenders point to the Surrealists' genuine anti-colonial activism, their opposition to fascism, and Breton's collaboration with Trotsky as evidence that the political commitment was real, even if it was never institutionally successful. Against the gender critique, the strongest defense comes from the women Surrealists themselves, who used the movement's tools to produce work that exceeded and challenged its theory, suggesting that the tools were more radical than the men who designed them. The critique that has no fully adequate defense is the one about the unconscious itself. Surrealism staked everything on a specific model of the mind, and that model has not survived in the form the Surrealists required. What has survived, and what neuroscience has increasingly confirmed, is the broader claim that conscious rational thought is a small fraction of total mental activity, and that the processes operating below conscious awareness are far richer, more structured, and more consequential than the Enlightenment tradition recognized. Whether this vindication is enough to save the Surrealist project is a question the next part addresses. Part 22. What Neuroscience Found Later. The Surrealists made a series of empirical claims about the mind without access to the tools that could test them. Neuroscience over the past 3 decades has tested several of those claims, and the results are more interesting than either a simple confirmation or a simple refusal. The first claim is that the majority of mental life is unconscious. This is now established beyond serious dispute. Conscious experience represents a tiny fraction of the brain's total activity. The neuroscientist Marcus Reichel, who co-discovered what is now called the default mode network, has estimated that the brain's intrinsic, largely non-conscious activity accounts for well over 90% of its energy consumption. Most of what the brain does, most of the time, never reaches awareness. The second claim is that the unconscious is not random noise, but has its own structure and logic. This, too, has been confirmed, though the structure is different from what the Surrealists imagined. The default mode network, which activates when a person is not engaged in a focused external task, is associated with mind-wandering, autobiographical memory, future simulation, and the spontaneous generation of associations. It is, in a rough but real sense, the neural system most closely corresponding to what the Surrealists meant by the unconscious, a mode of mental activity that runs on its own when rational, task-directed cognition steps aside. The third claim is that creative production benefits from reducing conscious control. Research by Roger Beatty and others has shown that highly creative individuals exhibit stronger functional connectivity between the default mode network and the executive control network. This means that creative thought involves not the shutdown of conscious control, which is what the Surrealists advocated, but a dynamic interaction between spontaneous unconscious association and deliberate conscious evaluation. The most creative minds are not the ones that silence the sensor entirely. They are the ones that allow the sensor and the spontaneous process to communicate fluidly. This is a significant correction of the Surrealist model. Pure automatism, the removal of all conscious control, does not produce the best creative results. What produces the best results is a flexible negotiation between conscious and unconscious processes. Joan Miro, who described his method as beginning in a hallucinatory state and then refining the results through deliberate composition, was closer to what the neuroscience suggests than Breton's theoretical ideal of pure psychic automatism. The fourth claim concerns dreams. The Surrealists treated dreams as the royal road to a truth that waking consciousness suppresses. Current neuroscience supports the idea that dreams serve important cognitive functions, including memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and the generation of novel associations. But it does not support the idea that dream content carries specific meaningful messages from a deeper self. The images in dreams appear to be generated by patterns of neural activation that are partly random and partly shaped by recent experience and emotional states. They are meaningful in the sense that they reflect the brain's ongoing processing, but they are not meaningful in the way a letter or a poem is meaningful, as deliberate communications from a sender to a receiver. The fifth claim, and the one where the Surrealists were most prescient, concerns the relationship between perception and construction. The Surrealists insisted that what we call reality is not a direct registration of what is out there, but a construction of the mind, shaped by habits, expectations, and desires. Predictive processing theory in contemporary neuroscience makes essentially the same claim in formal terms. The brain does not passively receive sensory input. It actively generates predictions about what the input will be, and perception is the result of comparing those predictions against what actually arrives. This means that perception is always already shaped by internal states, desires, expectations, prior experiences, exactly as the Surrealists claimed. The world you see is not simply the world that is there. It is a negotiation between what is there and what you bring to it. The upshot is paradoxical. The Surrealists were broadly right about the structure of the mind and broadly wrong about the method for accessing it. The unconscious is vast, structured, and consequential. Conscious reason is a small, late-arriving overlay on a much older and more complex system. But the Surrealist prescription, remove the overlay entirely and let the deeper system speak, does not produce the results they predicted. What produces the most powerful results is a collaboration between the two systems, a collaboration that is more like skilled improvisation than like surrender. Part 23. The Unfinished Project. Surrealism makes a claim that has not been answered. Not refuted, not confirmed. Unanswered. The claim is this. Ordinary waking consciousness, the kind you are using right now to follow these sentences, is not the full range of your mind. It is a reduction of that range shaped by practical need, social convention, and centuries of cultural training that have convinced you to treat this reduced state as normal and everything outside it as noise. Dreams, involuntary associations, the jolt of recognition when a stranger's face answers a question you did not know you had, these are not failures of the rational system. They are dispatches from a larger system that the rational one was built to manage and suppress. You can reject this claim, but notice what you have to believe if you do. You have to believe that the mode of consciousness produced by modern industrial civilization, with its emphasis on efficiency, utility, and measurable outcomes, happens to be the mode that gives the most complete access to reality. You have to believe that the vast majority of mental processing that occurs below awareness, the processing that neuroscience confirms is there, is noise rather than signal. You have to believe that the dreams you have every night, The images that appear when you stop directing your attention, the desires that surface without invitation, are less real, less true, less worthy of attention than the thoughts you produce when you're trying to be productive. This is a defensible position, but it is a position, not a self-evident truth. And the Surrealists were the first to name it as such, to insist that what modern civilization calls sanity is a choice, not a discovery, and that other choices are possible. The failure of Surrealism as an organized movement is real and well documented. The authoritarianism, the gender politics, the failed alliance with communism, the appropriation of non-Western cultures, the reliance on a model of the unconscious that turned out to be too simple. All of this is true. But the failures are the failures of a specific historical group, attempting a project that exceeds what any group could accomplish in a few decades. The project itself, the attempt to integrate the full range of mental experience into a single, coherent life, has not been completed. It has not even been seriously attempted again at the same scale. What Surrealism left behind is not a set of answers, but a set of tools and a set of questions. The tools, automatism, the colliding image, the game of chance, the surrealist object, the practice of urban wandering, remain available and continue to produce results in art, literature, film, and design. The questions are harder to escape. What is the unconscious, and does it speak? Is rational consciousness the mind's highest achievement or its most comfortable cage? Can art change the structure of experience, or can it only describe it? Is there a point, as Breton insisted, where dream and reality, the self and the other, the high and the low, cease to be contradictions? And if there is, what would it mean to reach it? No one has answered these questions. The rationalist tradition says they are badly formed. The scientific tradition says they are empirical matters still under investigation. The surrealist tradition says they are the only questions worth asking, and that the way to answer them is not to think harder, but to think differently. To let the mind do what it does when you stop telling it what to do. 100 years after the first Manifesto, this remains the dare. Not to understand Surrealism as a historical movement, but to take its central claim seriously enough to test it, not in theory, in experience.